Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience as we were waiting for all of you to come in. We're here today to talk about protecting information integrity in low and middle income countries, and really the future of news in the age of generative AI. My name is Irene Liu, and I'm with the International Fund for Public Interest Media. I will be the moderator for today's session. And with me, I have a number of esteemed panelists. Let me quickly introduce everyone just so that you know who we're here. We're taking advantage of technology and transcending geographic borders. We have Richard Gingras, who is the Vice President for News at Google. He is online, dialing in from California. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here.
Great. And then in addition, we have Nishant Lalwani, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the International Fund for Public Interest Media. We have Suk-Jung Lee, who's Senior Fellow and President Emeritus of the East Asia Institute. We have Nizar Patria, who is Vice Minister of Communications and Informatics of the Government of Indonesia. And we have Vera Zakem, who is the Chief Digital Democracy and Rights Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. So thank you all for joining us. Just a quick note about today's session. We are live streaming this, and so we do have members of an online audience who are also dialing in. We do have quite a long session, not as long as we had hoped, but we will be finishing up at 11:15. And so since we have that time, we will also be able to entertain questions from the audience in this room as well as online. So for those of you who are on the live stream, please do feel free to enter your questions into the YouTube chat, and we will be able to make sure that we answer some of those questions during the session. And for those of you in the room, we will take a break midway to take your questions, have a bit of a conversation, and then also at the end as well, just to mix it up and break it up. So thank you all so much. First, I basically would like to start the session by asking for everyone to give opening remarks to really just kick off the discussion about why we are here, right? We're really holding this panel because we want to discuss the connection between press freedom and democratic resilience, and the role that technology plays in enhancing and undermining these efforts. This is something that is, quite frankly, been really the theme of the whole conference so far. And so it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to be able to dig in to the themes that were discussed yesterday. So with that, I'd love to invite each of our panelists to share some opening remarks to really kick off the discussion. And so again, if you have questions as you're thinking through them for our online audience, please do put them in the chat. We will get to them. But first, I'd like to welcome Suk-Jung Lee, the Senior Fellow and President Emeritus of the East Asia Institute, and also one of the coordinators for the Summit for Democracy, to talk a little bit about the global trend of increasing authoritarianism, and also, you've written about, in light of this trend, that there needs to be increased focus on deploying ODA toward proactive democracy aid, which includes press freedom, in addition to election support and citizen participation. Can you elaborate on why you think free press should be a priority? And also, does South Korea's own experience offer lessons to the rest of the world?
Thank you for organizing this important panel in the South Summit Democracy venue. Let me say, I think free media is so essential for the process of democratization and also to consolidate democracy. And, I spent my youth years during the authoritarian period. So at the time, many newspapers were censored. So it's very important to have media telling the truth and also sharing the information. And right now, the atmosphere of the information ecosystem has changed dramatically. The printed media has been declining, and all this internet media has been increasing. For example, in South Korea too, we have about 5,000 newspapers, and about 4/5 are internet newspapers, right? So therefore, it's very, the big established responsible media, they have money, they have responsible reporters and so forth, but this internet media, even one-man media, has been used as spreading more extreme opinions and even some misinformation, disinformation. So therefore, I think the public interest media should play very, very important role to tell the true facts-finding news, and also giving more balanced and objective viewpoint in a polarized society. So for that matter, that's important. And you asked about the ODA. South Korea has committed to increase the ODA budget from the second year when our government hosted the Indo-Pacific Summit. It increased $100 million US dollars over 3 years, and they emphasize anti-corruption and so forth. But I'm the one who are saying Korean government should support independent media more directly, not through the government. Yes.
Thank you so much, Suk-jung. Next, I'd love to invite Vera to talk about your views in terms of how you deploy technology to create inclusive digital societies in developing and emergency democracies. How do you connect technology and press freedom to the democratic project?
Well, thank you so much for hosting this event, the International Fund for Public Interest Media, and to all of the guests, just so delighted to be here on behalf of the United States government and the U.S. Agency for International Development. I will first just give a shout out to IFPIM formally. For those of you who do not know, as part of the first Summit for Democracy and the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, we announced our support for International Fund for Public Interest Media. And the reason why is because, and this is very much related, because we need to give access. Not just the United States, but the international community, we need to give access, we need to give leverage to new and emerging media outlets to make sure that they're sustainable, to make sure that they're free. Because one of the things, because we know, as already been said, free media and press freedom are so fundamental to democracy. This is how we are accessing information. And so I just want to say how important this is, and how when we're talking about media and we're talking about technology, the role of artificial intelligence, how information is manipulated online and offline. All of this is interrelated, because we as global citizens, if we don't have access to basic information where we can make decisions about our lives, this is folks, this is just fundamental, right? It doesn't matter what it's for. So when it comes to technology, I just want to kind of highlight a couple of things. We are using, technology has been really, really important for us, and using technology, if you will, for good, but really also understanding some of the risks associated with technology, particularly not just artificial intelligence, that has been around for a bit now, but generative artificial intelligence, which is really very much a still new and emerging field. If you were yesterday at the ministerial and you heard Secretary Blinken say yesterday that the decisions that we're going to be making now in the next weeks and months ahead will have an impact for generations to come. And it certainly, I think, will also have an impact on the media sector as well. So a couple of things that we are doing that I do want to highlight. And this is particularly, I would say, the fact that we know when it comes to the media space, both online, both in social media and blogs, but also in traditional media, in print, in radio, both in the global majority and the global north, information manipulation is pretty pervasive these days. People have a hard time deciphering what's true or not, what's credible information. That's also, and then in addition, particularly in more authoritarian-leaning regimes, you have digital repression as well. And that is also, I always say that is the other side of the coin here. So what are we doing to address some of this stuff, particularly using AI? Because we know, again, AI is really cheap and it's effective, and it travels faster. It just travels so fast. We're doing a couple of things on how we're thinking about AI, and I do have one specific to media. There's one great example. First of all, with USAID, we launched our AI action plan, and that's really designed to safeguard against risks and protect potential harms. It also is designed to invest in talent, in prioritizing responsible AI, and understanding the role of these new technologies. For those of you who have been following on our government, the President Biden executive order also released on safe and secure and trustworthy artificial intelligence as well. And it's really establishing the approach throughout the US technological community, really focus on AI safety and security, equity and civil rights, and advancing of rights, respect, use of AI abroad. I do want to highlight one specific, to your point. I have other examples, of course, related to information manipulation, how we've used really creatively AI to combat disinformation. But there's this one piece around media that I think is really important, because we talk, I was just talking about media viability and sustainability, but also how important when we think about media, and particularly in strengthening democracy, how important also investigative journalism is to address corruption. So OCCRP, which is kind of a regional anti-corruption organization, is part of a team of several media outlets, including The Guardian. I'm going to totally mispronounce this, so forgive me. Süddeutsche Zeitung, Global Witness, and 17 other partners. They got access to 1.3 million leaked transactions from 238,000 companies, which was part of the Troika laundromat. This was a hefty and almost impossible data set to call through without the help of machine learning. So OCCRP built its own AI data management system to look for patterns among the thousands of PDF, CSVs, and Excel files, and was able to reveal more than 26 billion in transfers out of Russia tracked over a 7-year period to expose complex financial systems. So I give this as an example because to me, this is very much interrelated. So when we think about press freedom, freedom of expression, and viability of the media sector, particularly in the global majority of countries, we have to think about this as in the systemic approach and kind of, if you will, a holistic approach. So let me pause there, and I'm sure there will be more. Look forward to others' contributions.
Great, thank you, Vera. Now, moving to, again, the tech spectrum of the journalism tech connection, I'd love to invite Richard to talk about what you've seen as the deepening entanglement of journalism and technology throughout your career, first as a journalist and then as a media entrepreneur and now a tech executive for the past 12 years at Google. What are your observations about the current state of media in the internet age, and where will it take us in the new age of generative AI, particularly in the global majority markets?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Irene, for being part of the panel and for your work at IFPIM. And I simply want to note, as you have communicated to me, I've recently asked to join the advisory council of IFPIM. Very pleased to do so, very pleased to do what I can to assist your work. But to your question, and I have been around a long time, I think there are lessons that history teaches us about the relationship between technology and media. Nearly 50 years ago, I was at the Public Broadcasting Service in Washington. I was working on building the first satellite network for the distribution of television programs. My mentor was the visionary founder of PBS, Hartford Gunn. And he said something to me then that really guided my career. He said, Richard, the evolution of media is tied to the evolution of technology. Technology creates the playing field upon which media plays its role. That was not obvious then. Certainly wasn't obvious to me. It should be obvious today. The two are intertwined, and it's very important that we recognize that as we look to address the evolution of media in obviously our very complex digital landscape. That satellite network, for instance, was a huge advance. The dramatically lower cost of distribution to cable systems and television stations enabled a greater range of programming and advertising opportunities. It was disruptive. The marketplace for consumer attention was fiercely more competitive. Television was an early disruptor of print media. We forget this, but it's true. Cities went from having many newspapers in the 1950s and 60s to having only one or two by the end of the 70s. For those left standing, it was an ever more successful business. In that time, you could think of newspapers in 1985 as the internet of its community. But now, of course, we have the internet. It is an extraordinary resource to our societies and to the practice of journalism. It enabled access to information beyond that which we could have imagined. It enabled the participation of diverse voices beyond what we could have imagined. It has created a vastly more competitive marketplace for information, good, bad, and indifferent. It eliminated the geographic constraints on distribution and on consumer consumption. We can all access information from anywhere in the world to any other part of the world. It has, without exaggeration, from a creation standpoint or an authoring perspective, enabled expression by putting a printing press in anyone's hands. Of course, the internet has also challenged our societies. It enables access to a world of content, as I've said, both good and bad. And yes, it has further disrupted the business of print media. But that is not to say that there cannot be sustainable commercial and non-commercial media models in our digital world, and I expect we'll talk about that a little bit later. We have seen tremendous growth in the number of people accessing news online. And for print publishers, that is at once a challenge and an opportunity. We have also seen dramatic shifts in the preferences of younger audiences around the world. The lesson is clear. Traditional media must meet consumers where they are, in the formats and models they prefer. So what's the lesson in all this? It's that innovation is critical. And sadly, in our 25 years of the internet, innovation has not always been at the forefront of legacy media. Jim Brady, who's now at the Knight Foundation and was once head of digital at the Washington Post, said it best. When the internet happened, legacy media embraced their fears and did not embrace innovation. They sought to recreate their old world rather than innovate toward the new. That is an extraordinarily important thing for all of us to keep in mind. The world of journalism cannot afford to do that. It must embrace innovation, not fear. It must embrace change, not stasis. Embrace the power that AI can bring to the newsroom. Don't ignore it. Which doesn't mean we ignore the concerns we might have. We need to obviously address those as well. But innovation is critical. And I don't say this to suggest that technology is a panacea. It is not. As I often say, technology has value, but it doesn't intrinsically have values. The values and ethics we want to see will only happen through the dedicated efforts of journalists, of technologists like me and my colleagues at Google to work to make that happen. None of this is any less or more true in the global South than in the global North. I think the challenges and opportunities may be different, but the principal need to adopt, adapt, and innovate are the same. And I will continue my efforts, and Google will continue its efforts in this regard to enable that kind of exploration and innovation. I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much, Richard. And now, Vice Minister, I'd like to turn to you because you have been a longtime journalist who is now in the role of regulating both tech companies as well as media in Indonesia. President Jokowi recently signed the presidential regulation on publishers' rights, after a long consultation, years-long consultation process between the media and tech companies. I guess the question is, where do you go from here? And what are the top issues that you're focused on relating to the future of tech and media?
Thank you, Irene. Good morning, all. Good morning, speakers and distinguished guests. Yes, to respond to your question, for many years, publisher and digital platform have coexisted in a symbiotic relationship in Indonesia. However, the dynamics of these business relationships have evolved, and it has become increasingly clear that a new framework is necessary to ensure its long-term sustainability. The publisher rights, this regulation is not about regulating content or stifling freedom of the press. It is about fostering a fair and balanced business environment between publishers and digital platforms. The core objective of this regulation is to promote a healthy and collaborative ecosystem for Indonesian media. It established an independent committee to oversee the implementation of these rights, ensuring transparency and fairness throughout the process. The positive gestures we have witnessed from all parties, all stakeholders in Indonesia, thus so far, are promising sign of the regulation potential to create a win-win situations. Eventually, this regulation aspires to achieve two vital goals: to ensure the continued existence of quality journalism and to guarantee the long-term sustainability of Indonesia's media landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister. And now I'd like to turn to Nishant Lalwani from the International Fund to talk about, sort of as a longtime funder of media in low and middle income markets, what do you think is needed for public interest media to survive and hopefully thrive amid technological and business upheaval to the business model?
Thanks, Irene. Ensuring that public interest media survives and thrives is in fact the mission of the International Fund for Public Interest Media. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we created it and how it was created. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here at the third Summit for Democracy. As Vera mentioned, the first Summit for Democracy is where President Biden, President Macron, other heads of state also established their support for IFPIM and pledged both financial commitments, but also political support for our initiative. And that's really crucial for two reasons. Firstly, because it recognizes, just as Vera was saying, that public interest journalism is crucial for us to achieve our development and democratic goals. Without pluralistic, inclusive public interest media ecosystems, we can't, as Maria Ressa, our board chair, would say, we can't have shared facts, shared narratives, and without those, we can't have trust. And without trust, democracy cannot function. So when at the first summit, there was so much support for the International Fund, it recognized the importance of independent journalism in democracy. The second thing it did is that it recognized that no one nation can do this alone, right? This summit and previous summits have emphasized collective action. And whether it's the matter of information integrity, of regulating, of developing Gen AI ethics and values that will improve society, no one country, no one company can do that alone. It's collective action that is really required. And by supporting the International Fund, which is the first multilateral vehicle in history designed to support independent media, I think the community of now 16 donors that fund us recognize that collective action is crucial on this issue. Since, as Secretary Blinken mentioned yesterday, since that first summit, we've more than doubled the US contribution. We now have raised around $50 million. from a diversity of donors, including the US, but of course also including France and Switzerland, New Zealand, Estonia, Google, the Ford Foundation, Luminate, MacArthur Foundation, and many others. And while we have a diversity of donors, we also have a number of really important supporters. The government of Ghana recently made an in-kind contribution. They're the first government of Africa to make a contribution to IFPIM. The presidents of Moldova and East Timor sit on our council and will be helping set the overall kind of direction and mission for IFPIM. This is a truly global coalition that we're building, and it's the first of its kind to address this issue of public interest journalism. Talking of what's required to ensure journalism thrives, money isn't the only thing that's required, but you can't do it without money. There's been an existential crisis in the business models of journalism in the last 20 years. And we can talk more about why that's happened, but as the UN Secretary General said when talking about IFPIM, he said media extinction is happening in many countries. And of course, where advertising rates are lower, like low and middle income countries, the kind of countries we work in Latin America, in Africa, in parts of Asia and Eastern Europe, that's where the business models of journalism are most precarious. And so we've started to try and remedy that. We, since our launch on World Press Freedom Day last year, we've distributed now $9 million or so to more than 30 organizations in 16 countries. About 80% of that funding goes to media organizations who are showing either signs of imminent collapse, and we're trying to keep the lights on in election year in countries like Georgia and Ghana and South Africa, where media needs vital support to report on elections. We're also supporting media that is showing signs of innovation. Just as Richard was saying, innovation is crucial. But when you don't have money, it's really hard to invest in experiments. It's really hard to take risk if you barely have money to pay your staff. And so we've been providing financing to many organizations. About 60% of our financing at the moment goes to organizations that are trying new revenue streams, that are innovating around reader revenue, around different sorts of sponsorship. And then perhaps, most crucially, about 20% of our capital so far has gone to systems change efforts, where we're looking at providing fairer value exchange between technology companies and media organizations. And we think that's really crucial to ensure, it's a win-win situation to ensure that media is compensated and that technology companies and others who value journalism can continue to use it and continue to ensure for their own products and continue to ensure that it's that the value exchange is fair. We've also been working on a number of national funds for journalism. We launched one in Sierra Leone in June of last year. There's similar projects we're funding in Brazil and also working on a project like that in South Africa, trying to crowd in money to support media at this crucial time. Because if we don't, news will die out. And if news dies out, then democracy will be irrevocably damaged.
Thanks, Nishant. So I want to recognize that as one of the conference organizers, Suk-Jung won't be able to stay for the entire panel. So I'm going to turn my question to you next, which is, we will get to the business model and the themes of the importance of money in trying to, kind of further economic resilience as well as allow adaptation to technology. But I actually wanted to ask you, Suk-Jung, about Korea, because Korea is in a very unique position in that in recent history, it has gone from a global majority economy to now a donor. And it has become a global technology driver, as well as domestically, it's developed its own information technology ecosystem in the form of Naver, Kakao, and others. I'm wondering how that homegrown tech infrastructure, which, by the way, also directly licenses content from news organizations and contributes quite significant funding to the media ecosystem in Korea. How you think that's affected, how users get information in Korea, and also how it's affected Korea's own democratic development?
I think the information ecosystem of South Korea is rather unique because we have a very competitive IT tech companies which play the role of platform. So therefore, many Korean users use a Naver or Daum to see the many newspapers because they play the role of platform. So there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between the printed media and also the platform business. And there was many controversies about, how the Naver, for example, do see that the ranking, if certain newspapers article is become popular, they put those newspaper in the first order. So that created a backlash. So now they don't do that because of more diverse opinions to be heard through the newspapers. And also, I would say because of a very strong Korean media and platform companies, I think Korean users do not expose that much to international media. So that can be good, that can be bad, because some Koreans don't know much about the international society's opinion and many different opinions. So this is a kind of blessing and also some difficulties about the strengths of Korean IT companies and media. I think there is a lot of debate how the Korean, the tech companies should be responsible for the spread of disinformations. So we did a survey, actually, East Asia Institute, about how the Koreans view about disinformation. And the majority of the Koreans worry about this disinformation. At the same time, they value about the freedom of expression. So therefore, they are not keen about the government regulation. Rather, they like to attribute the responsibility to the information content creators. However, I can use my YouTube or I can contribute anything very easily. That's the current ecosystem environment. But it's very difficult to chase the original news source and bring the case why he or she spread this information. So it's not plausible one, actually. So therefore, then they think the tech companies, which are playing the role of a platform, should take a more role to sort out the wrong information and also get leading of biased and also hate speeches and so forth. So for that matter, the Korean companies and Korean government also looking at the European model like a Digital Service Act. And also looking at the American model, which is more, the more self-regulation of big tech companies. So it's very difficult to regulate the IT business and also the news media. So therefore, I will say, because of this difficulty of implementing any regulations, the responsibility of established media, because they got the broadcasting companies and also established medias, the users tend to trust those, of course, more than social media. And according to international poll, not only Koreans, the many people in the world, they use social media heavily, but they don't trust that much social media as a source of the public information. So for that matter, I think there is opportunity and also the innovative future for the public interest media to be successful under this environment.
Thank you so much, Suk-jung. Richard, I'm going to turn to you because I think that globally this question of who should be regulating content, who should be moderating content, is one of the central tensions relating to the fight against mis and disinformation. Users don't necessarily trust government to play that role for freedom of expression reasons. People don't necessarily want tech companies, or tech companies themselves don't want to be in the role of deciding what is on or off the platform. And then there's the question, what is the responsibility of the user? We heard this yesterday, this question, how much pressure, how much responsibility should we put on individual users to be able to discern between mis and disinformation and fact? Yeah, where does the responsibility go? And how do we balance that? How does Google balance that tension?
Well, you raise, I think, what is one of the most complex questions of our times in our open societies. That it really gets down to that key question of how do we manage free expression in open societies? It's a bit of a paradox. Obviously at Google, we've been in the middle of a lot of discussions about this. In terms of, for instance, in our own efforts to deal with the harms of misinformation and disinformation. What can we do to make sure that we're not amplifying unduly sources that aren't providing quality information? But as you pointed out, it does put the very difficult question of who decides what's true and not. It's been interesting to me as I've looked at the evolution of regulation around the world with regard to misinformation that it becomes quite challenging. How do you define awful versus lawful in any country? How do you address these questions when politicians themselves are declaring one outlet to be fake news and the other one to be, thoughtful content, and vice versa? So it is indeed very, very complex. I think we have to approach it in as many possible ways as possible. One is, from a tech company perspective, is are we doing our responsible best to make sure that we're not unduly amplifying inappropriate content? From a search engine perspective, are we doing our best to make sure that we're surfacing authoritative sources on whatever query you enter into the Google search box? That's on us to be responsible in that regard. I think it's part of the responsibility of the press to do its best job to advise users as to how they can identify and suss out good information versus bad. That gets very tricky too in a world where there's partisan press, right? So they're very complex issues. As far as users are concerned, I think the best we can continue to do is how do we educate people, not just children in schools, but adults as well, in this complex digital world, to have some sense of how to understand the sources of content they're interacting with. Do they know the source of the content they're interacting with, such that they might make a more informed judgment as to whether they should believe what they're seeing? So indeed, I don't think there's any singular answer here. Except for us to continue to try to address the problem. We use technology to do that as well. AI has become very helpful in our own efforts to, at scale, identify problematic content, at scale, identify content that's outside of our policies and take quicker action. But, as someone said many years ago, it's an arms race between those who are looking to spread disinformation and those who are looking to manage it. And so as best as we can put in defenses, then the guys on the other side, the bad actors, will obviously seek to overcome those defenses.
Thank you, Richard. Vice Minister, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who has sort of been on the journalist side as well as now on the government side, and especially given the diversity of Indonesia as a population, both in terms of religion and ethnicity, what are the top concerns, and how do you think about, sort of the challenges of fighting mis and disinformation while also protecting freedom of expression?
Thank you. I agree with what Ricard just mentioned, because we are facing a very complexity digital landscape right now. addressing misinformation and disinformations, especially with the growing of generative AI tools. There is an increasing risk of synthetic content production. Such contents include false and compelling instruments like deepfake videos, voice cloning technologies, and production of fake websites. A report said that the amount of deepfake videos circulating online around the world is going up by 900% each year. And I want to give an example from Indonesia national elections that we reveal the generative AI used to spread mis and disinformations, and it targets a very specific demographic, including the elderly, young people, and rural inhabitants. And the recent elections brought a few deepfakes videos, but their quantity was relatively small. A notable instance was a deepfake video of President Jokowi speaking Mandarin fluently. However, the public did not easily accept this content because immediately a counter video is spread, also a deepfake showing the president speaking Arabic. So, yeah, that's a very unrealistic truth. Yeah? And despite the irrationality of these videos, the public was not deceived by the spread of such deepfake content. And our data indicates a significant decrease in the spread of disinformation during 2024 election compared to the last national election in 2019. In recent election, we identify 227 instances of election-related hoax content, a substantial reduction from the 714 instances found in the previous period. This achievement is inseparable from the Peaceful Election 2024 campaign by the Ministry of Communication and Informatics, which was disseminated through various media channels. In addition, the Improving National Digital Literacy Index has also provided a more limited space for the spread of election hoax content. Indeed, there were issues related to election result disputes, but these were more associated with the electronic recapitulation system rather than the information disorder. Thank you.
Well, that sounds quite promising and speaks to the kind of cooperation or the kind of multi-sectoral efforts to fight mis and disinformation. I'd like to, before we turn to questions, I want to ask one more question about the media landscape, which is really, I think, very important as we discuss the global majority, but even within countries, which is how we deal with the growing disparity in the media landscape. Because if money doesn't solve all problems, but is necessary to ensure that there can be a healthy information ecosystem, and technology is a tool to help ensure distribution, how do we ensure that smaller and independent media organizations have access to the right tools and the ability to compete in the media markets of the future? And this is a question that I'd like to start with Vera, if you could answer, and then Nish, you could follow up.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think there's a couple of things. Money is wonderful, but there's never probably enough money to really fix the media ecosystem around the globe in global majority everywhere, although it's really important because of exactly what you just mentioned. But I think there's a couple of additional components, and I'll just kind of rattle off a few of them. There needs to be will. The will is really important. The political will, not just of the countries, but of donors. I can't stress enough how important donor coordination is in this realm, because that will is also really important. I think this is one of those problems that also needs to be addressed from a multi-stakeholder approach. And, you know, and again, it's not just about, and then also, Richard talked about technology, how important the technological innovations are in this space. I mean, I'll just mention one quick thing to actually address some of this. Last year, at the last Summit for Democracy, we launched the Media Viability Accelerator, actually designed to do this very thing. And this really was a partnership, speaks to both the multi-stakeholder partnership here, but also how important to address this particular challenge between USAID, Microsoft, and 6 organizations that support independent media in the developing world to really address the financial challenges that media face by developing AI-powered data aggregation and visualization tool to give these outlets in basically with market intelligence, right, to help with revenue creation as well. One last thing I'll mention on the donor coordination, how important that is, because no one organization or government entity or foundation or a multilateral institution can solve this alone. We need actual, not just donor coordination among donors so we know where to prioritize our investments, but we also need actual no kidding commitments as well, and sort of principles that countries and donors actually want to abide by. So one of the things that we're pleased to see is the new principles on relevant and effective support to media and information environment. They will soon be launched on March 22nd at the OECD Development Assistance Committee for considerations. They're drafted with donor consultations and really set the guidelines for renewed assistance to media, and in global majority, and very much reflect the realities that we're facing in. So it's really kind of not one entity, but it's an all size fits all. It's all hands on deck because although money is really important, I do not disagree, but there's different pieces of this pie. So I'll stop there.
Great. Nish, did you want to weigh in on this before we'll just to give everyone set expectations, we'll just take a couple of questions on what we've discussed so far, and then we'll go back into a bit of a chat. Yeah, okay. And does anyone in the audience have questions? Or do you all, oh, yes, please. I think we have a microphone that will be passed, just so that everyone in the audience can also hear.
Thank you very much. I'm Dagmar Schmidt-Atali. I'm the ambassador of Switzerland, and I'm really listening with great interest to your discussion. And just the last question you had, and I would be very happy if somebody of the panel could elaborate on that, because it's also the profession of journalist, because we need money, but journalist is a profession, they have a salary. And what is the business model that we really can assure that we have good journalists and that we don't, I see it also in Switzerland, there's kind of a concentration of the media landscape, but that you have also local journalism, because local journalism is also important for accountability of our democracy. And as we're here now in the Summit for Democracy, I would like to get your input. What business model, without being a donor, but what business model that a newspaper, a newsroom can survive in a free economic market? So that would be my question.
Ambassador, you stole my next question. You literally, which is great. So why don't we tackle that actually? Because I think that this really comes to the meat of what everyone is very interested in. I don't know how many times we've said the word money or funding in this panel so far, but it would have been a very interesting drinking game if we had done that. So actually, to that question, Richard, if I could turn to you. So, we've seen that the business model for news, particularly in low and middle income countries, hasn't recovered from the advent of the internet. And so, I guess, the challenge also is that, especially in the global majority, reader revenue is not yet a viable option for all but a few publications. So, how do you view the kind of need to not only sustain, but also prepare and innovate?
Well, I think, and I might be a little bit provocative here, but I've been, studying this around the world for a long, long time. And first, I'd suggest that we clarify the assumption about the business model, that the business model for news is broken. across the board. I don't think that's true. We need to understand that the disruption largely impacted massive and dominant legacy publications, as I said, that were the internet of their communities before we had the internet, right? The vastly competitive information marketplace of the internet particularly impacted those those businesses that were largely dependent on big advertisers in the prior era, the department stores that were disrupted by e-commerce, or classifieds, for instance, which moved to the internet. Now, that impacted publishers in North America more than anywhere else, or more quickly, because advertising was nearly 90% of the revenue model. That was 50% in Europe and elsewhere. So I just think we need to be careful about presuming that advertising as a source of revenue is past history. I don't think that's true, and we have good evidence to suggest that's not true. We should not presume that the disruption of large dominant print publishers means that emerging digital publishers cannot find success. They can, and they do, particularly given the digital dynamics where the cost of distribution and the technical cost of production is near zero. So let's not presume that the days of for-profit news publishing are in the past, because they're not. I've met several exciting emerging players in the global south as well as in the global north. I'm going to talk about a couple quickly here of emerging players, one City News in Italy and another Village Media in Canada, that are profitable, digital, non-paywalled, ad-supported news offerings for the communities they serve. Their success is based on a deep ongoing assessment of the information needs of their communities. Yes, they do serious accountability journalism, which is at core, but they also go beyond that to serve the community's broad array of information needs. And that is key to the success of their model. They've rethought the advertising models to meet the needs of businesses in the communities they serve. You know, one thing that someone pointed out to me recently, I think is quite true, is that advertising is the lifeblood of local economies. The success of players like City News and Village Media are models that others can follow. There's great value in that model. It serves broad information needs, meaning, you know, obituaries matter, local sports matters, community events matters, because they attain far greater reach. Village Media, in some of their communities, they reach 50% of the population with their daily email newsletter, which enables the advertising to be effective and creates a far larger audience for the serious accountability journalism that readers are less likely to seek out. So I don't want to suggest that this is all easy, but there are folks out there who are making it work. And I think it's important that we make it work, that we make advertising work. Because in my long history of being part of the independent press, including nonprofit media, the one thing I've learned is this, that an independent press is only independent to the extent it is not dependent on singular sources of support. A mixed revenue model is really critical. A mixed model, including advertising, provides the financial backbone to take on hard subjects and creates that security to weather the loss of any individual single source of funding, right? So if I lose one advertiser out of 500, I'll be good. If I lose one funder out of 5, I'm in trouble. And if I'm dependent on a tech company for financial support and the market changes for those tech companies, that's a problem as well. So I just want to make sure that we don't take off the table the fact that there are revenue opportunities, mixed model revenue opportunities that people are finding success with. But there too, those who are finding success, it came out of innovation. It came out of rethinking the approaches, including rethinking the approaches to advertising itself. So I would just encourage us to consider all of those dynamics as we figure out how to mold, whether it's our guidance to the emerging publishing community or consider regulation, that we recognize that we need to stimulate those various activities, because simple government support or foundation support, I don't think is a comfortable long-term solution all by itself.
Thanks, Richard. And Nishant, are there, from what you see in terms of the work that the International Fund is doing, what are new systemic approaches aiming to create long-term sustainable media markets in global majority markets?
I mean, there are some really exciting experiments being tried by organizations, and there are certain themes out there as well. One of the things that almost every geography we work in the Global South has in common is that young people are a majority of the population. And there's a lot of data to show that young people are pretty disaffected with the news and with institutions in general. And so it goes without saying that young people are the future of democracy. And unless they're engaged with independent journalism, with the facts of their societies, they're not going to be able to be productive members of democracies. And those news organizations we work with who have acknowledged this problem are among the ones that are being the most successful. So Mutante, for example, in Colombia, is a media organization which it's very diverse. Staff are extremely young. There's more than 90% women in leadership. They have structured conversations using their staff writers, online and offline conversations with young communities in Colombia about issues that are of interest to young people, climate change, gender, and so on. These have high levels of engagement. They listen to what their audiences are saying. They don't just talk at them. And there are some really interesting sponsorship models as well. So there are corporate institutions, large corporates in Colombia and regionally across Latin America that want to sponsor these conversations. That's a much higher model. It's a much higher margin model of advertising than programmatic advertising. And it's allowed them to build significant revenue without giving away any independence or editorial control. They have other sources of revenue too, but it's sort of, two birds with one stone, really. You're engaging young people that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be reading daily news, and you're also increasing revenue. So there are models out there which need to be supported in this way. Of course, to do so, Mutante and others need the capital to keep their newsrooms alive.
Thanks, Nishant. Vice Minister, I'd like to turn to you now, because around the world, we're seeing increasing numbers of government effort to force tech companies to support the news industry through regulation. We spoke about the Indonesian regulation publisher code. South Africa is holding a competition commission hearing on the subject as well. What do you think is the government role in mediating between the tech companies and their interests, as well as the news organizations and their interests? So what are you prioritizing in this regulation?
Yes, first of all, I'm very interested in the question of the excellencies. It's about the business model. As a person that involved for many years in media industry, I think this is a big concern to find a business model for media industry in the future. But unfortunately, I think there is no ideal business model until today. And all of media industries globally still seek for an ideal business models. And I can say that the future of journalism also at the crossroad. Because what? Because we need to balance between the independency of the press freedoms and also how to be sustained in these new media digital landscapes. In Indonesia, I think we have some business model from media industry to survive, and the creativity to produce news content combined with the marketing strategies, what we know as the native content advertising strategy, very common right now in Indonesia. And I think it will threat the media independence as well, because it blurs the demarcations between the newsroom independence and marketing interests. So this is a big question to the media industry globally, I think, and not many media industry, I think, that can survive with this new model. We can say that the New York Times models become a reference, yeah, globally. Many media industry in some countries try to copy and to replicate this model, but it is a very high cost, high investment. We need to change our media companies to become tech companies. And that means the high investment is very urgent. So that's a big problem, because the dependency of media industry to the big techs, I can say, that should be in the future, should be reached to the new harmony or new deals that can protect the media sustainability and also press freedom. And what Indonesia can do with these situations, our government try to do some interventions by establishing the regulation framework, what we know as the publisher rights. And the top priority of this publisher right is to ensure the media sustainability and to protect the press freedom, because we need what? The healthy media, a digital media landscape in Indonesia with a healthy information and also give the access to the public with an accurate and quality journalism. That's all.
Thank you, Vice Minister. And Richard, I'd like to turn to you specifically on the question of regulation. I'm wondering, from the Google perspective, what is workable regulation? And also just a question about how these regulations are negotiated. Does this have to be an adversarial process? In terms of, government puts out some sort of regulation that then tech companies have to respond, media companies join into the fight, and there's a lot of arguing. There are acute needs right now to support the information ecosystem, and we hear that everyone needs to play their part. I'm just wondering, from a technical standpoint, what do you think is the way forward, and what is a better way to ensure that kind of multi-stakeholder process when it comes to regulation?
To your point, first of all, to the extent it's adversarial, I think is deeply problematic, and we strive for it not to be that. I want to give a quick sense of thanks to Vice Minister Patria. We've collaborated extensively in Indonesia as they've worked on the presidential law. Now, a lot remains to be seen. We have continued to express, our devotion to the principles that we make sure to respect the openness of the web, so that we can help build those audiences, that we look to stimulate, I think, in any country, a diverse range of voices, including new emerging voices. So I will choose to be optimistic about the approach in Indonesia, and we'll see how it plays. But I think first, to your point, we have at Google proactively engaged for a long time. We are among the largest funders of journalism around the world. In fact, I don't know who's larger. Engage with the ecosystem and engage with policymakers. We have proactively brought and delivered system-level solutions to countries before legislation was considered. So we'll continue to do that. It has long been, in our view, important to be collaborative and not adversarial. The Google News Initiative, as you know, Irene, was an ongoing effort to co-develop and support, for instance, the delivery of tools, training, and programs for news organizations and journalists. I think it's a paragon of that collaborative principle. And so we'll seek to continue to do that. In our case, our support for the news industry and a healthy information ecosystem is not the result of regulation, but in some cases in spite of it. And indeed, our proactive efforts have allowed us to reach outcomes, as in recently in Canada, that negated the most damaging consequences of an unworkable law that was passed in Canada, right? Even so, the outcome in Canada came at a meaningful cost to innovation, to Canadian consumers, and to the news industry. Because the law that they had proposed or actually passed would have required Google to pay for links, Facebook to pay for links. Now, we have worked around that with the government, but Facebook has entirely withdrawn news distribution from their products in Canada, which is an unfortunate and deep loss to Canadian publishers in the order of 30 to 40% of their traffic. I should also point out that as much as we want to be collaborative and engaged, some regulation we've observed is a blunt force instrument that forces platforms to deploy funds in ways that don't ensure that deserving publishers receive support. In some cases, it has forced us to wind down programs that support smaller publishers in order to fund a broader allocation based on the regulatory models. So in our view, workable regulation should not be equated with short-term transactional solutions that are designed to ignore the foundational principles of access to information, or to impose unworkable frameworks on how the internet works, or for that matter, to overstate the value of news to any particular platform and its users. It needs to incentivize innovation, as we keep saying, be designed to improve consumer access to a plurality of news, and encourage a range of editorial perspectives. So I think finally, I would say that, the role of journalism in open society as a whole, informing the community about matters of public interest or holding democratic institutions to account, all of society's participants and institutions should be encouraged to support the continuing viability of the news ecosystem. And I think it's unfortunate that so much of the dialogue today is about singular tech companies, rather than stepping back and saying, how can we look at this in a broader, more appropriate way that engages in an environment, an ecosystem that can actually make journalism sustainable in the long term?
Thanks, Richard. I am going to actually pull back at your suggestion. And before we take maybe one more question at the end, because we're nearing time, the discussion of the role of external financing, including official development assistance, ODA, and the role of philanthropy. And I'd like to open this up to Nish first, and then anyone else who wants to comment on that.
Thank you. And, we've talked a bit about some of the bright spots in terms of business models that are working. We've talked about some of the opportunities for, long-term value exchange. We really applaud the publishers' rights regulation in Indonesia, and hope it develops, well over the next 5 or 6 months. In the meanwhile, though, for most media organizations in most of the global south, there aren't sustainable revenue models. And that means that public interest journalism in those places is dying. There's essentially been a market failure for a public good, the public good of accurate information that individual citizens can use to make the decisions they need in their lives. Now, what happens when you have a market failure in other sectors, in health or education, or banking even? The state steps in, because losing that public good is too detrimental to society. And in health, you have the Global Fund for TB, malaria, and AIDS. In education, you have the Global Partnership for Education. In media information, we're the first institution to do that. And we've done that in part so that we can increase the number of donors that can actually do this. When we're asking donors, why aren't you funding media? Why aren't you funding more? They would say, well, it's very difficult for states to fund media directly because of political interference or the perception thereof. If you look at data on this, this is a topic, disinformation, information integrity, that every politician is concerned about in the world right now. And yet the recent report by the Center for International Media Assistance shows that just 0.3% of all foreign aid goes towards supporting media and information. That's just between $300 and $500 million a year. That's peanuts when it comes to, I mean, this whole summit has been about information integrity in AI to some extent. You know, it's a huge issue, and we're spending nothing. Furthermore, in the last 10 or 15 years, that number hasn't changed. I think we can all agree that information integrity has really changed. It's degraded in the last 10 or 15 years. Disinformation is on the rise. Democratic institutions are less stable than they were. And yet money and contributions have not increased. Lastly, of that $300 to $500 million, just 8% of that money goes to supporting media institutions in low and middle income countries. 92% does not, right? It's retained by other entities. So 8% of $500 million is $40 million a year. You know, just this year, the International Fund for Public Interest Media will do about 20 million in grants, and we're not even a year since launch. So there's real scope to correct this market failure, just as in health, just as in education, donors have stepped up. There's the opportunity to do this now. Vera?
I was jumping at the seat because I just couldn't agree more with you, Nishant, and with Richard too. Richard, I'm like in love with the line that you said, independent press is only independent if it's, I wrote it down, if it's not solely dependent on one source of support. And I say this because in this space, media and information environment, goes back to multi-stakeholder, multi-donor approach that is not on the global level, but also at the local level. This has to be it, because it's not just of all of the partners who are here at the Summit for Democracy, and of the governments. It has to be also foundations, it has to be private sector, and it has to be multilateral partners. And this is, I think about, this is one of those critical challenges of our time, because it's really, again, the through line. And it comes back to the point that I made earlier, to access to information just to live our lives, regardless of where you are, your background, just to be able to also get goods and services, everything. And so that's why I think as an international community, as a collective community, we're so seized for this. And I really do agree with Nishant that when it comes to lower and middle income countries in global majority, this particular challenge is pretty severe and significant. And that's why, I will tell you at USAID, one of our models is not just about multi-stakeholder approach, but really building those partnerships from the global to very localized contextual ways. Because you have to meet the people where they are. You have to, through media, reach the audience where they are in order to give them access to information and address some of the inherent challenges that we've been talking about, whether they're, facilitated by technology or AI or not, or lack of community building, everything else. So yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Great. And Richard and Vice Minister, I'd love to get your closing thoughts as well. Richard, do you want to go first? Oh, we can't hear you suddenly. I think he.
Yes,
okay, great.
closing thoughts. I mean, again, I don't need to really repeat much of what I said. We are at this extraordinarily interesting point in times of the development of our digital societies. And I just can't stress enough the need to, yes, bring together sources of support, many sources of support, do what we can to continue to drive innovation. I mean, again, let's not forget the interesting thing we talk about, the cost of operation. The cost of operating a news outfit in today's world is so much different from what it was 40 years ago. Not to say it's easy, but the technology and capabilities are there to really help us begin to invent the future of news. And I think that's very much what we're eager to continue to be part of, is how can we do our part as Google as well as encouraging other institutions to help enable that innovation such that the younger generations today who have lost their interest in news or lost their trust in sources of news can regain that through new voices and new capabilities that are helping them to understand their societies and take action where they feel they need to take action and vote in an informed way, as in open democracies we would all like to see happen. So I thank you very much for the discussion and always glad to continue it beyond today's session.
Thank you, Richard. Vice Minister?
Okay, thank you. I would like to remind us about the new disruptor that is coming right now, what we call as generative AI. And therefore, we humbly propose a crucial and timely global initiative, the annual Global South Forum on AI governance. This forum's primary goals are, first, to convene a diverse group of stakeholders, including international organizations, NGOs, governments, industry leaders, academics, community representatives, and others. This will facilitate comprehensive discussion on the development challenges and opportunities presented by AI. And secondly, to develop the concrete deliverables and action plan that empower the Global South to capitalize on the benefits of technological advancement. And thirdly, to encourage knowledge and technology transfer related to AI development within the Global South. And I think this initiative, we have mentioned this in the UNESCO Global Ethics Forum before, and Indonesia is ready to be a host if every parties or stakeholders agree. I think that is what we can propose to this panel. Thank you.
I love it. Ending on an action item. That is amazing. So by the time we all come back next year, we will have solved many of these issues, right? We are over time, but thank you so much for sticking with us and really appreciate it. I'd like to thank our amazing panelists for your wonderful conversation. Can we just give them a round of applause, please? And of course, thank you to the organizers of the Summit for Democracy. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.